So we're going to have to redo this episode after you screwed it up last time, but that's okay. Life moves on.
I blame the goblins.
Oh, God, not again. So last week we talked about lower back pain, and today we're going to continue that conversation. And Kevin, I know you work more in the professional setting, but I have to admit, man, I've heard every excuse under the sun about either why people have back pain or the things they do to fix it that are just completely nonsensical. So I've heard, if I just stretch, I don't have any low back pain until the next morning. People just think, okay, I'm going to do this, hamstring stretch and I'll be good to go. I've heard, of course my low back hurts. I'm getting older. It's just a result of getting old. That's just what happens. Kind of ridiculous. And then, I have lower back pain because I played football in high school. You got tackled once, and then all of a sudden you think that that's the end all be all. That's the only possible reason you have back pain, not because you sit for 8 hours a day at your desk job and then go home and then sit and watch TV on the couch and then lay in bed and sit and then get up the next morning and then sit and have breakfast and then drive in your car and sit. None of those are reasons, just because you played football in high school. Have you heard any of these reasons?
That guy's back probably hurts because he carried his football team in high school. That's why his back hurts. So you can thank the other 21 guys on the field.
Yep. No, I like that. Yeah, he carried the team back in high school, so now his back hurts, not for all the other factors that I listed there.
Right. But just like you said, just running through those factors of the almost just like the average life that we all live, like low back pain is definitely one of the most common issues that I know you talk about, that you experience. But just strength and conditioning coaches in general, as well as like any type of like physical therapists or athletic trainers.
Yeah.
And it's crazy though that we're seeing this happen at such a young age. Like anyone around our age or over the age of 23 seems to have some type of low back pain.
I mean, you and I are perfect examples.
Yeah. But obviously nobody wants it, yet for some reason it's just so common in all these people.
Yeah, it's really so prevalent. I'm going to give you some of my opinions as to why it is so prevalent. Now, granted, these are opinions. Some of them are kind of fact, but most are opinions. Take it with a grain of salt. I definitely get a little fired up when I have this discussion. But, one thing I talked about, the sitting all day, getting in the car, sitting, going home, sitting, this chronic sedentary lifestyle that begins in grade school is definitely a part of the reason that A, we have back pain, and B, that we don't move well, right? This inefficient movement, right? These inefficient movement mechanics that also stem from that lack of knowledge of proper movement mechanics are also being driven by the fact that we have this sedentary lifestyle and we don't use our body in the proper ways. Then we go to the gym and we load these improper movement mechanics. And then we choose the wrong exercises. And then we couple it with improper movement mechanics, improper exercise technique, and load. It all becomes, a very big problem. Unfortunately, too, at the same time, we have a quality control issue in the field of strength and conditioning and in the field of physical therapy and all the other healthcare fields that relate to movement. Unfortunately, there's just poor incentives for intelligent individuals to join our field, right? To join the field of fitness, to join the field of movement, because we don't get paid all that much, at least at some level, right? At the very bottom level. And it turns out people actually do things for the money. And if we aren't doing our job at establishing this community as something important, something vital that has value and that, cost a fair amount of money in order to get that return for your employees, you're not going to attract intelligent individuals to come out and train for you. Also, I have to admit, this is where we start to get really speculative, but I think there's a decent amount of fraud and corruption in the healthcare system and in the insurance system that really encourages doctors to just give out drugs and prescribe surgery instead of proper movement and, referring out to a trainer or physical therapist for things versus just, cutting into somebody and giving them a hip replacement before you've even given them a chance to learn how to move well.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with all the points you've stated, especially just like the lack of proper movement. I know we both read Zach Dakin's book, Movement Over Maxes. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me is loading improper movement is not progress. It's actually a problem.
Yes.
And so if you can't move well, it's just like the analogy I mentioned last week about having your axles offset and your tires sit here and keep getting worn down and you need to get them changed or rotate or whatever. The problem isn't the tires. The problem is the alignment's all messed up.
Yep.
And it's the same thing with the movement. If you have poor movement, your alignment's messed up. And to attest to that last point you brought up about like uh, the insurance industry and the doctors, obviously,
Mhm.
my situation I had like with the low back, back in school,
Yep.
ended up blowing a couple discs out. Surgery for me, I wanted to be like last option.
Right.
And fortunately, I was able to do enough research and had good people around me that gave me a proper path of like, hey, this is what you should be doing. And here I am, like I'm able to squat, I'm able to do heavy weight again, and I don't have low back pain, and I didn't get surgery.
And when you were first going through this, though, I remember our junior year, we had professors who were supposed to be biomechanics experts, who were supposed to be exercise science professionals, and they couldn't give you those answers. It wasn't until you got to the Red Sox, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were able to solve a lot of these problems, correct?
Yeah, and a lot of it came from coaches that were had followed Dr. Mcgill, again, another guy we brought up last week,
Yep.
talking about low back pain. Just his teachings, like the guy is just an expert in the field of low back pain.
Yep.
And so it's just, I don't want to say it's, if you have the time and you have the interest, definitely go search him into Google. He's written a couple books, especially low back and performance. Um, Definitely check it out. But if you have low back pain, you are not alone. Roughly 85% of the population at some point develops some kind of low back pain. And a little over 10% of these people that develop it are disabled by it. Again, if you listened last week, John and I talked about both the anterior and the posterior oblique slings and how the purpose of these slings are to promote better force transfer and allow rotation and locomotion. But if you're not training rotation as part of your like quote unquote core training, this could definitely lead to low back pain. Obviously, just training rotation is not the only solution. You need to be able to have stability in all three planes, the sagittal, the frontal, and the transverse plane.
Yep.
The best posture is the one that's always changing.
I
And
really like
another,
that. You said that yesterday when we first recorded this podcast. I really, really like that statement. I've never heard it before until you said it yesterday. But definitely a big fan of that.
Eric Cressy.
Eric Cressy.
So again, having a complete approach to spinal stability, like I said, being able to control all three planes of motion is the best situation to help you prevent low back pain from ever coming up.
Yep.
And so last week we talked about the AOS and the POS. Now today, you and I are going to talk about the other two slings, the deep longitudinal sling as well as the lateral sling.
Yeah, and before we go into this, obviously I know we're re-recording this podcast. We talked about this yesterday, but I listened to a lecture on the the NSCA website because I had to do some continuing education units. And it was this guy, David O.T., and I want to give him a shout out because although I disagree with this one point, I liked his lecture in total. It agreed with a lot of things that I believe, and it gave me a new perspective on some other things. So this guy, David O.T., David O.T.E.Y., go check him out. I found him on Instagram. Definitely seems like he knows his stuff, but one of the things he said about rotation is he trains anti-rotation in a kneeling stance, but once you go to rotation, he believes that should be in a bilateral stance and up. He believes that it limits hip involvement, which he thinks is one of the main um, rotators of the body, which I agree to an extent, but I also think that being in a split kneeling or a kneeling position, I was doing it today with one of my clients who has pretty bad low back pain, and it was helping her out greatly. Um, these split kneeling and these kneeling positions are important for rotation and rotational training.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just like the point I had brought up yesterday. It's obviously we want to train the system as a whole. We want to be able to train everything working at once, get the proper coordination. But sometimes if people struggle, like say they struggle with thoracic spine rotation, you might need to put them into a situation where it isolates that. And so they can really focus on just thoracic spine rotation.
Yeah, instead
And
of hip
then,
rotation.
yeah, almost treat it as like a regression before you start going on 2 feet and doing rotational stuff, whether it's like med ball or with a cable machine or whatever. Like they need to understand how to actually rotate and what it feels like before they get some type of compensation or the sling's just not working.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
So when you look at the spine, it's just, if you Google the spine, it's going to give you a picture of just like this bony column. And so the spine is composed of discs. So you have every segment is its own vertebrae, and in between each vertebrae, you have an intervertebral disc, which helps cushion. So the spine is attached to the pelvis, which is our hips, via the sacrum. This joint is called the sacroiliac joint, also known as the SI joint. And if you've had low back pain and you've went to a doctor and gotten it checked out, chances are you've actually heard of this joint.
Yeah, I know when I was young and first started experiencing lower back pain, I was probably about 18, and I went to a doctor, um, and he told me it was like SI joint dysfunction, and then I went to a physical therapist. It was the same thing. So it sort of went from there, and that's when I got introduced to this joint. Obviously, I know a lot more about it now, whereas before I thought I knew something, but of course I didn't. So the structure of the pelvis and the sacrum are designed to promote spinal stability. So the actual structure of itself, right, these two bones connecting, that's called sacroiliac joint form closure. And we're going to talk about another type of closure later on. The region itself is called the lumbopelvic hip complex, or LPHC. You're going to hear that a lot, either in my blog or throughout the course of this podcast. And the structure of our spine and our pelvis gives us what we call passive stabilization. So not active stabilization, but just passive stabilization.
Yeah, and this passive stabilization was actually looked at in the study that we had mentioned last week, where they had the spine in just an isolation environment and they wanted to see how much force it can withstand before it started to buckle. And they saw that the results came from that study that roughly 90 newtons of force, which converts to about 20 pounds of pound force, which isn't a whole lot.
Right.
Um, you hit that threshold and the spine itself starts to lose stability. However, when you add in all the other structures, talking about muscles and fascia, other joints around it, our spine can withstand up to 1,500 newtons of force. Obviously, like I said, there are many other components that lead to having spinal stability. But in the end, the more spinal stability we have, the less chance we have of experiencing low back pain.
Our neurological system is also going to play a pretty big role in the spinal stability. It's not just the structures of the spine itself, right? Those intervertebral discs, those vertebrae in that pelvis and sacrum. And you can imagine your brain and spinal cord almost as like the body's version of air traffic control, right? Air traffic control, it coordinates, takeoffs and landings on different runways. You can imagine that as all the different, if we can picture our muscles edge runways, the different sorts of actions and relaxations that have to happen, almost as takeoffs and landings of planes. So it's really trying to coordinate the muscular system, just like air traffic control is trying to coordinate all the planes taking off and landing. And you can imagine at an airport, if this does not happen and does not happen properly, air traffic control cannot coordinate all of these planes taking off and landing at the appropriate time in the appropriate place. There's going to be balls of fire out there, and it's going to be a crazy scene. The same thing occurs in our body. If our body, our central nervous system, our brain, our spinal cord cannot coordinate all of the muscles properly to contract and relax the appropriate points, chaos is going to ensue.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy because, like you said, the central nervous system, you can look at it as like that air traffic control. And so obviously it's anticipating movement, just like air traffic controls anticipating planes coming in ready to land or getting ready to take off. but it also responds to the movements as well. So
Yeah.
when you look at like sprinting or jumping, you get the brain telling the muscles to create that like pre-tension, ready to absorb force. So like when they talk about like in sprinting, like Altis um, and other like sprinting courses, they talk about like preparing for ground contact. They want the body to be able to absorb that ground reaction force to be able to help transmit it through your body and help to continue to propel you going forward. If your body's not ready for that force, it it's going to be lost. You're going to
Right.
put an extreme amount of force into the ground. Force is going to come back up, and your body's going to have no idea what to do with it.
Yeah, exactly. And all of this leads to further stability of the spine. Obviously, if these muscles are contracting and relaxing at the right points, then we're going to have more stability. If we only have 90 newtons with that passive stabilization, now we have 1500 newtons, with all these muscles in this fashion and all these interconnected systems. If they're also working optimally and the CNS is doing its job, then obviously you can imagine there's going to be more stabilization there. But you can obviously imagine, like I said, if the CNS was not able to do this job, air traffic control was not able to anticipate these things, right? The timing of the takeoffs and the landings. Like I said, there's going to be fiery balls on the runway of the airport. If your CNS cannot predict and appropriately apply movement, instability and pain are going to be the result.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our CNS has a few different strategies it utilizes to actually help improve this spinal stability. When you look at it, it divides it into two situations where you have a static as well as dynamic portion of this. So in static situations, it use the deep muscles to help stabilize that SI joint as well as the surrounding structures. So a lot of this is like your erector muscle, like your erector spinae, a lot of type 1 like muscle fibers because they take advantage of that. Like obviously you need to have the endurance. You're using them all day, but these are also strong as well to help create that stability at the spine.
Yeah.
Then when you look at the dynamic movements, this is more like the superficial muscles that utilize this approach. And so it helps create almost like dynamic stability. We can talk about like the obliques, um, your other core muscles, your rectus abdominis, like everything else that's more closer to the skin. That's what
Yeah.
superficial means. And so it utilizes both of these systems, the dynamic and the static, in this like global approach to help create stability. The central nervous system also recruits these interconnected body slings, just like we're talking about today, like the AOS, the POS, the deep longitudinal, and the lateral to help create motion and stability. And throw another quote out there, like you said it the other time on the podcast, like as one sling is creating motion, the other one's controlling it. And I think that's a
Exactly.
really big picture for people to understand that these slings do work in harmony. They're always working together. And so while one's shortening, the other one's lengthening and controlling it. They need to work together or else we're going to have issues. Likewise, it's also important to remember that all these body slings cross the LPHC, the lumbo-pelvic hip complex that you touched on earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So the importance of the slings is to create stability in that region. So it's important just to remember that they do cross that area. Another important spinal stability mechanism is muscular force transfer. So this is what we've been talking about, right? The transfer of force throughout these slings, making sure it's efficient and effective and coordinated. Um, so, these are the deep and global musculature that we talked about that CNS recruits in order to make sure they're all coordinated, like I said, and happening at the right time. And, when they respond efficiently and effectively, they're going to provide this further stability of our spine. I know I'm saying a lot of the same things over and over again, but it's really important that we understand that our body is an interconnected system. With coordination, we will be significantly more stable. And if we're in pain, then we can imagine that there's something going wrong, there's something inefficient or ineffective happening, and it could be a result of these slings not working in unison, the CNS not working to make sure the slings are working in unison, not coordinating these slings. So as much as I'm saying it over and over again, it's really important to keep this in mind. This muscular force transfer, the stability that it causes and it creates, using these slings that cross the LPHC. This is called force closure of that sacroiliac joint. So before it was form closure, we just talk about those passive structures, but now we talk about force closure, and that's what's going to get us closer and closer to that 1,500 newtons of force that we can withstand. And like Kevin said, talking about all of those things that do create that 1,500 newtons of force that we can withstand. It's not just our muscles, but it's our fascia that's going to help connect these muscles. It's our ligaments, and it's our tendons as well.
So now diving into the good stuff. Okay,
Diving in, baby.
Head first into a 4-foot pool. Okay. We're going to talk about one of the two slings that we're talking about today, the deep longitudinal sling. So it's made up of these structures: your erector spinae, your multifidus, your thoracolumbar fascia, your sacrotuberous ligament, and your biceps femoris. So for a lot of people, that's just a bunch of scientific jargon.
That was just jargon, man. Even to
So,
me, it was just jargon.
So to spark note it, okay, you're talking about the muscles that are very close and directly attached to your vertebral column.
Ah, okay.
Going down to the fascia, which is just above your butt. It's just a bunch of collagen.
You said butt.
Going down through your butt, down into your hamstring. The biceps femoris is one of your hamstring muscles. So if you were to draw a line, it's going down your spine, off to the side, out towards your hips, the outside of your hips, and then down your leg.
On both sides too, right?
Correct.
Cool. So the deep longitudinal system, or the DLS, is a key contributor to SI joint stability. I know there's a lot of acronyms. Maybe I'll just try to say everything out as its full thing, but I really don't want to. I'm going to keep using the acronyms.
Figure it out.
And contraction of this DLS will put that SI joint in an optimal position. What it's going to do, part of its job, it's going to help posteriorly tilt the pelvis. If you've listened to some of the podcasts in the past, you'll know what this posterior tilt of the pelvis is. Especially if you're one of my clients, you're definitely going to know what this is. We talk about it every single time we train together. But pretty much your pelvis can either be tilted forward or tilted back or neutral, right? Most people, right, because they have this sort of weakness at these core muscles, especially in the anterior side of their body, the front of their body, they're going to be tilted anteriorly. So they're going to be tilted forward. You can imagine this almost like a bowl of water, Kevin. I think you said this, was it on the core training episode?
Yeah.
You talked about the bowl concept. So if our pelvis is a bowl and we tilt that bowl forward, the water in the bowl is going to spill out the front. And we don't necessarily want that all the time. We want the water to be in that bowl. So we want to find a little bit of posterior tilt with that pelvis. As a result, right, the sacrum, which we've talked about, at that sacroiliac joint that's attaching to that pelvis is going to rotate forward. So obviously the people who are just on audio can't see this, but the my right hand here, this is my pelvis. My left hand here, this is my sacrum. And as I well, it's my right, my left,
Okay.
not yours. As I tilt this pelvis backwards, what happens as a result is my sacrum rotates forward. And this counter rotation movement is called nutation, and it locks the pelvis and the sacrum in place. So like I said, that's called nutation. It's almost like you can picture, a nut screwing onto a bolt. Same idea. If I have, nutation the other way, if I'm tilting my pelvis anteriorly, that sacrum is going to posteriorly tilt. That's counter nutation, and that is what we don't want. That improper movement is gonna be where a lot of bad things happen.
Yeah. And you can almost imagine it as like when you're talking about doing it the correct way of the posterior pelvic tilt and then the sacrum tilts forward, you're tightening that nut onto the bolt.
Mm-hmm.
And the flip side, when it's rotating the opposite ways or the ways that it shouldn't be, it's loosening it up.
Yeah.
And so obviously these are improper joint mechanics and can lead to degeneration of this SI joint when this happens. And obviously the more this happens, the limited stability and degeneration can lead to having low back pain.
Yeah, and it's not even just the this is a little bit longer term type pain, but having that improper mechanics and those joints rubbing on each other poorly over time, they're going to degenerate, and that's going to lead to a lot more chronic pain. That's going to be a lot harder to fix. So we want to try to fix these problems as soon as possible. So this deep longitudinal sling that's posteriorly tilt that pelvis, it's also helping us, holding us upright. And when you are upright, the tension at the muscles in your upper back, which are still connected, right? It's that erector spinatus that goes all the way up, is also going to tighten the structures at your lower back. So this is going to help further improve that lower back stability, and again can decrease that lower back pain. So we're getting it from both angles.
Yeah, and obviously we want to make sure that we can remain upright. We don't want to walk around like the hunchback of Notre Dame
Nope.
and can't control. We're always in like that flexion pattern. We want to be able to stand upright. And so we need to strengthen this DLS to be able to maintain that proper position.
How,
You had,
Kevin?
well, an example that you brought up was a dumbbell goblet reverse lunge, which would actually
Yes.
be a great exercise to do this. Having the
For
weight
a lot of things too, maybe.
having the weight in front is going to force your center of mass to want to fall forward. And so to counter that, you need to be more erect and come back up. I would say, honestly, when I was looking at this, the video that you had posted on your blog, my first thought was my favorite exercise, the barbell front right reverse lunge.
Yep. Very
That's,
similar, except you can do a little more weight.
yeah,
Like
that's
that
what the
one
big
time where
boys
you
do.
did the 315 on the one leg. That was crazy.
Yeah, and then I did on the other leg.
Do you think you could do that right now? Like if you did it today?
If I like just rolled out of bed and did it.
No, no. If you proper warm up and all that sort of stuff.
Uh, well, quarantine is hit me
Not
a little
helping.
bit. In my prime though, and I've got witnesses that were
Okay.
down there in the academy with me. I was
Okay.
hitting 315 for 5 singles.
That's impressive.
And then I almost
Because
blew my knee.
that dumbbell that I was holding, that was the max I could do right there. I think it was like 25.
Well, then like the next day I almost blew my knee out trying to catch my phone sliding off the bed.
Oh,
Did I ever tell you that
yeah, I
story?
remember that.
Yeah. Freaking put my phone on the bed. It's connected to the charger and it's all tile floor. Obviously, these blankets very silky because they're great. And so I put the phone down and I start walking away from the bed and I see out of the corner of my eye, oh shoot, my phone's going to fall. So I go to plant and I turn the other way. Well, socks on tile, not a great idea. Thought I blew my ACL out. I was scared. But yeah, I ended up just being on crutches, had to get like an MRI and everything. But
Yeah,
in reality, I was just a little Sally. So
just being a baby.
yeah.
Do you have another
Um,
example of a good DLS exercise that people could do, or
anything, I would say like anything just like front rack or anything where like the weight is anterior to your body, so like in front of your body. So even if it's just like a front squat, um, even just like a split squat or any type of lunge pattern, anything that's going to have that load in front of you and it's going to cause you to want to lean forward, you obviously want to counter against it. So you're going to be more upright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So the lateral sling is another body sling, if you didn't know, and it goes along the lateral side of your body. Wow,
Really?
I'm saying groundbreaking things
Wow.
right now.
You just dropped a knowledge bomb on me.
Um, so this includes the glute medius, which is like one of your butt cheek muscles that's sort of off to the side, like the side butt cheek. So if you want like a nice round booty, you got to work out this muscle here. So isn't that how that works?
Something like that.
And then you have the gluteus minimus, which is still on the side a little bit, but underneath that glute max and that glute med. Then you have your TFL, which you've definitely probably heard of, especially if you're a listener of this podcast. That's your tensor fascia lata. This is kind of a crazy muscle because it does a whole bunch of different things. And it also can compensate for a lot of bad movement at the same time. But this muscle, along with your glute max, attaches to your IT band. But we're not talking about the glute max today. But this IT band going down the side of your leg, which you've definitely heard about, this connects that whole lateral sling together and allows the system to operate as one.
So when you look at this if you can picture, just like how we pictured the line going down the deep longitudinal, if you can draw a line for this lateral sling and you can picture what you think the purpose would be, during walking, this lateral sling helps to keep the pelvis from dropping on the side of the swing leg.
Yeah.
And so it tries to keep that pelvis neutral and have pelvic stability. And a good example of this is if you ever watch like runway models walking and they sit there and they shoot their hips back and forth. And if you slow it down, you look, this like hip drop motion is actually what the lateral sling is trying to prevent from happening.
Yeah, and exactly. And this hip drop mechanism occurs usually in people with weak hips. Obviously, oh, well, I mean, they could. It's definitely very possible that these runway models have weak hips. Maybe they do. But at the same time, with people with these weak lateral hips, they get this hip drop. The hip drop when you're walking is called the Trendelenburg gait. So it's a pretty common term in the strength and conditioning industry. So if you hear it pop up from your trainer, your coach, or physical therapist, now you can kind of know what it is. And then when we talk about this hip drop in single leg movements, like a squat, it's called the Trendelenburg sign. So definitely in single leg squats and single leg hinges, I see this all the time where the person's going down on one leg and the non-working leg, that side hip is dropped off to the side because the working side can't hold that hip level. It's definitely very interesting to watch happen. And this lateral sling works through concentric hip abduction, isometric hip abduction, right? So this preventing of the Trendelenburg sign and the Trendelenburg gait, that's isometric hip abduction. But it's also going to concentrically work through hip abduction as well, right? Taking that leg and bringing it out. When it is weak, hip adduction occurs, right? So this hip drop and this Trendelenburg sign occur, and that's the drop that we see.
Yeah. And so definitely go check it out on YouTube. I'm sure there's plenty of videos
Millions of
and you
videos,
know
yeah.
exactly what we're talking about. Unless you want to see a video of John shaking his booty while he's
I'm not
walking.
gonna I'm not gonna do that.
Okay, well then just go
I,
to
I
YouTube.
would, but it's just moving around the computer and everything for the camera wouldn't make any sense.
But just like you said, like obviously having this hip drop is definitely going to have negative impacts because of the uneven forces that are distributed that are occurring, like when we're
Yeah,
walking, or even if it happens when we're walking, it's going to happen when we're running, and running is more forceful on the body. So
right.
now you're talking about even more forces that are going to be going through and they're not controlled. Obviously, it can lead as well to improper SI joint mechanics, which in turn can lead to low back pain. This would cause, because of this instability of controlling the pelvis, one side hiking, one side dropping, is going to cause improper lumbar spine mechanics. Okay? The lumbar spine is not necessarily made for these types of movements. It's made for stability.
Yeah.
The improper mechanics at the hip can also lead down the chain to the knees and to the ankles, and this can have negative impacts as well. So what I mean is, if you can't control your pelvis, now all of a sudden you're going to get a compensation at your knee where your knee could cave in, or you'll get internal rotation, which in turn will cause more pronation at your feet. So it's almost just like a domino effect of, if you can't control this thing, everything else that's attached to it is going to suffer.
And I'm sure you probably see this too, but a lot of times when I see, an arch collapse at the foot or internal rotation at the knee, I'm not thinking, okay, they have bad knees, they have bad ankles, they have bad calves. I'm thinking up the chain to the hip. Do you think sort of that way as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think the big quote that I took early on when I just being around the Rangers was, proximal stability leads to distal mobility.
Yeah.
And again, talking about that joint by joint approach that we talked about a couple weeks ago, if you're able to do the proper jobs for the joints that are closest to the body, whether it's mobility or stability, everything else down the chain is going to follow in line.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that was definitely one of the turning points for me personally, was just being able to not look at the body as individual pieces, but again, this interconnected whole. Anytime we have improper loading of joints, problems can definitely occur. So we have to train these slings to be balanced in their effort to stabilize our spine, right? We have to treat our body as this interconnected whole with these systems that want to work together and not against each other. This is going to be the biggest key in reducing lower back pain, knee pain, ankle pain, shoulder pain, especially if we talk about that thoracic spine that should be rotating. And if it's not, that shoulder has to compensate for a lot of that. A great lateral sling drill is the side forearm bridge, right? The side plank, you might know it as, just it's working that whole thing, and having to hold up your body is such an important skill to be able to do, especially on the side. And any sidestep variation too, I think is another great lateral sling drill. Do you have any others that you can think of that might fit really good here?
Yeah, early on, I like to when like incorporating like teaching pelvis control. I like to get guys like laying on their side and just doing like a side lying abduction.
Yeah.
So they're laying on their side, that top leg, they're going to try and raise it as high as they can. Obviously, teaching them the proper movements first, and then applying just some simple resistance, whether it's manual or throw like a little like band around, like a green band or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
to help give them some type of resistance. That's definitely like where I start. But yeah, I would agree. Like any type of like banded sidestep variation and frontal plane stability is going to incorporate this lateral sling.
Yeah.
So obviously, at the end of the day, just like you said, we have to train our body as a whole unit. We have to train as like this systemic approach. Sure, like there'll be time for isolation. You can sit there and do your bicep curls in the squat rack, you friggin' tools, and sit there and go do leg extensions on the machine. Like those are obviously fine, except curling in squat rack. I'll fight you. But if we want to bulletproof our spine, we have to work as one whole system. It's that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, again, just treat that body as a whole, not as a whole bunch of individual pieces. It's the biggest thing I see working in a general population gym is just everybody working out individual joints, and not even like the most important ones. The most I see people do is like bench and curl and do tricep extensions. It's like, man, there's more things going on.
That's yeah. Another like when you talk about like those mirror muscles, you sit there and like you have to
Yes. Oh, that's the perfect way to put it.
yeah, like those are just for show.
Those
Okay.
are for show.
Everything else on the backside, your posterior side, that's for the dough. So you want to talk about longevity, okay? Lift some heavy weight in a deadlift.
Oh, well, I think we can end it there.